By the end of the second week of development, chorionic villi begin to develop. So these are finger-like projections that consist of chorion, and it projects into the endometrial wall of the uterus. By the end of the third week, blood vessels develop in the chorionic villi. These blood vessels in the villi connect the embryonic heart, or connect to the embryonic heart, through the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein that run through the connecting stalk that's eventually going to become the umbilical cord. So we're developing a vascular supply that's going to merge mom's vascular system with that developing embryo. This merging of blood supply is laying the ground for the next stage, which is placentation, or the forming of the placenta. So remember, the placenta is the site of exchange of nutrients and waste products between mother and the fetus. So the placenta also is going to be able, once it's fully formed, to produce hormones that are needed to sustain the pregnancy. The placenta is very unique because it develops from tissues from two separate individuals, the mother and the fetus. By the beginning of the 12th week, skipped ahead a bit here, the placenta has two distinct parts. So it has the fetal part that's formed by the chorionic villi of the chorion, and the maternal part that's formed by the endometrium. So when it's fully developed, the placenta is shaped sort of like a flat pancake. Functionally, though, the placenta allows oxygen and nutrients to diffuse from mom's blood into the fetal blood, and allows carbon dioxide and other waste products to diffuse from the fetal blood into the maternal blood. The placenta also has a protective function because it provides a barrier that most organisms can't pass through. However, certain viruses like the AIDS virus and German measles, chickenpox, measles, encephalitis, and poliomyelitis are able to cross the placenta. In addition, many drugs and alcohol and some substances that can cause birth defects also pass the placenta very easily. The placenta also serves as a storage for nutrients such as carbohydrates, proteins, calcium, and iron that are released into the fetal circulation as needed to supply that growing fetus. The actual connection between the placenta and the embryo, though, is going to be the umbilical cord. So the umbilical cord is going to develop from this connecting stalk where the blood vessels were just running through. It's usually about 20 to 24 inches long. It consists of two umbilical arteries that carry deoxygenated fetal blood to the placenta, and one umbilical vein that carries oxygenated blood and nutrients to the fetus. In some cases, the umbilical vein is used to transfuse blood into a fetus, or even to introduce drugs for various medical treatments if there is an issue with the fetus. About 1 in 200 newborns only have one of the two umbilical arteries. It may be due to the failure of the artery to develop or degeneration of the vessel happening early in the developmental process. Nearly 20% of infants born with this condition are subject to later developed cardiovascular disorders. After the birth of the baby, the placenta is no longer needed, of course, so it detaches from the wall of the uterus and then, of course, is delivered through the vaginal canal, so it's called the afterbirth. At this time, the umbilical cord is going to be tied off and then cut. A small portion, which is usually about an inch of the cord, remains attached to the infant, and it's left to just dry up or wither away and fall off. This usually happens about 2 weeks after birth. The area where that cord was attached later becomes covered by a thin layer of skin, and scar tissue forms, and that scar tissue is the umbilicus, what we commonly call the belly button. Pharmaceutical companies have found a way to use human placentas as a source of hormones, drugs, and blood, and sometimes portions of the placenta are used to cover burn injuries until the tissue begins to regenerate. The placental and umbilical cord veins can also be used in blood vessel grafts because, they're no longer going to be used. Why not put them to use somewhere? And cord blood also is very often removed from these vessels and frozen so that later in life if that infant, once they're grown or as they're growing, develops some sort of disease or disorder, and stem cells could be a possible treatment. Those umbilical cells, of course, are going to be pluripotent stem cells, and that can be used to repopulate bone marrow following chemotherapeutic or radiation drug treatment for certain types of cancers. Now, as we know, normally the placenta remains attached throughout the pregnancy and is then detached and delivered after the baby is born. But in some cases, the entire placenta or just a part of it can be implanted in the wrong part of the uterus, and it may cover or partially cover the opening of the cervix. And when this happens, this is a condition called placenta previa. Although placenta previa may lead to spontaneous abortion, or what we commonly call miscarriage, it occurs in about 1 in every 250 live births. It is dangerous, though, because the fetus may cause premature birth, and it also may cause hypoxia in the fetus due to maternal bleeding. Maternal mortality or death of the mother is increased also due to hemorrhage and infection that may accompany this condition. But the most important symptom is a sudden, painless, bright red vaginal bleeding in the 3rd trimester. And when that does happen and it's diagnosed that placenta previa is present in the pregnancy, most of the time a cesarean section will be performed rather than allowing for the normal vaginal delivery that could result in the death of the mother. Okay, so we jumped ahead to where we had the placenta fully formed and talked a little bit about the functions of the placenta, but now let's back up and look a little bit more at the development of the embryo. So the 4th through the 8th week of development is a very significant time in the embryonic development because all of the major organs appear during this time. This time of development is called organogenesis, which simply refers to the beginning of all of the organs and the organ systems within the embryo. By the end of the 8th week, all of the major body systems have begun to develop, although their function is usually minimal at this time. By the middle of the 4th week or so, the upper limbs have begun their development as just little outgrowths that are called upper limb buds. By the end of the 4th week, the lower limb buds develop as well. And at the end of the 4th week, the embryo has the appearance of a slight but very distinct tail. So a lot of times when I'm teaching this in lab, I'll say that if it's an embryo, it looks like an alien. Once it becomes a fetus, it starts looking more like a baby. So during the 5th week of development, there is a very rapid development of the brain. So the growth of the head is massive at this point. By the end of the 6th week, the head grows even larger as compared to the rest of the body, and the limbs have begun even more development as well and have lengthened. The neck and the trunk start to straighten out. The heart has already formed and is now a 4-chambered structure, very much like we will find after birth. All right, so at the start of the 8th week, or I'm sorry, by the 7th week, the limbs have become more distinct and you have the beginnings of the digits, so the fingers and the toes start to appear. At the start of the 8th week, which is the end of the embryonic period, the digits of the hands are very short and webbed. The tail is still shorter but still visible. The eyes are usually open. The auricles of the ears are visible. By the end of the 8th week, all areas of the limbs are apparent. The digits are very distinct and no longer webbed because the tissue that was between them has been removed through apoptosis. Remember, that's programmed cell death. Also, the eyelids come together and may fuse. The tail disappears. The external genitalia begins to differentiate, and the embryo now has human characteristics. So at the end of the 8th week, the embryonic period has completed and we begin the fetal period at 9 weeks of development. So during the fetal period, which is from the 9th week until birth, tissues and organs that develop during the embryonic period are going to grow and differentiate. very few new structures appear during the fetal period, but the rate of body growth is extensive, especially during the second half of the life during or inside the uterus. For example, during the last 2.5 months, half of the full weight is added. At the beginning of the fetal period, the head is about half the length of the body, but by the end of the fetal period, the head is only about 1/4 the length of the body, so the body does a lot of catching up during that time. During the same period of time, the limbs increase in size from about 1/8 to 1/2 of total length. And the fetus is also less vulnerable to damaging effects of drugs and radiation and microbes as it was during an embryo. Because remember, when a particular part of the body is developing, that is when the fetus or the embryo, is more susceptible to damage to those particular parts. So as you can see in the image here on the bottom of the page, from the 4th week to the 36th week of development, there's a lot of changes going on in that embryo and then that fetus after when the 9th week begins. Your textbook has a good table that gives you a summary of what's going on at different periods. We've just sort of done an overview of this, and of course that's as deep as I'm going to expect you to be able to test as well. But it is very interesting, so I expect that many of you will want to take a look at this further as you study the developmental period.